Good morning, everybody. My name is Kathy Wall, and we are into our first minute of our SIP webinar. We have a great program today for you. I'm the director of the Inclusion Collaborative, and this is being funded through the Supporting Inclusive Practices grant that we have. We have a webinar today entitled Action Planning Phase 3 for your Inclusion Collaborative sites, for your inclusion sites. And I'm going to introduce my guest here, Dr. Holly Wade.
Hello.
Assistant
Superintendent
of the Palo Alto Unified
School District.
I have to practice this better, don't I? At any rate, please be more than welcome to write in your question and answers. And we have a QA that we'll be able to be checking. We are going to go ahead and get started on our webinar right now. And Holly is going to go ahead and tell us her story from Palo Alto, which is very exciting, actually, if I can get it to work. There we go. Oh, resume slideshow. By the way, this is my first webinar on my own. It's exciting. Welcome, everybody. All right, I think we're going to go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks for having me today. As you may or may not know, we were recipients of the SIP grant last year, and we have been honored by that work, and we certainly continue all of our efforts around building inclusive schools for students across our district. So I'll first start with a little background about Palo Alto Unified and building our inclusive model. Are you going to do that?
I am.
Okay, we're working on slides. I see there are 6 of you out there, so good morning, 6 of you. And I guess if you want to write in questions, we have an opportunity certainly to answer your questions real time as we go through this.
So I'm trying to do slideshow.
So a little bit about me. I came to the district in 2010 as the director of special education. 2 years ago, I changed roles and became the assistant superintendent of student services, overseeing both special education, student services, as well as our Welcome Center registration process. The slides attempt to chronicle our journey in the last 6 years towards building inclusive schools, and happy to answer questions as we go. Again, just telling you a little bit about our journey towards building inclusive schools. So one of the things we started with was a premise, and I think it's important, and we'll revisit this quite a few times as I talk this morning, and that is, what's your message? What's your platform? And I think we started with certainly some ideas about how our schools were structured and how our students were being supported, but one of the key messages that I certainly hung a lot of weight onto was students who belong will learn. So belonging is an important part or an essential part of learning, and I think as we started to look at our communities where learning was happening, this was the #1 thing that we kept coming back to, and that is, how do we create belonging for all students in the school district?
Next slide.
Next slide, sorry. Next slide.
Come on, next slide. There we go.
One of the first things we did was we built a vision for the Department of Special Education. And as you can see, this vision absolutely calls out a couple of key messages. And one is that we are going to build inclusive school communities, that we're going to honor diversity and individuality, and that we're going to help support exciting environments where all students are considered in the learning and in the planning for the learning. So this was a key component of our first year in building that shared vision.
Very critical.
So for today, I was asked to do three things actually. Talk about our action planning, how it related to the 7 years since we started this work in Palo Alto. Look at developing and monitoring timelines when you do action planning. Setting, I think, priorities is a big part of our work initially. And then talk about recommendations where we are now. And that will be at the end, and talking about our next steps in the district. So in 2010, 2010, that sounded odd. Okay,
it sounds so
here we are.
Ago already.
It's like I'm just talking to a black screen. Anyway, okay, in 2010, we had a preschool through 12th grade school district, including post-secondary, obviously, and we were building an inclusive model, and we were clear on that. And why that was an opportunity for the district was, there were a couple of factors. The first one was there was a district leadership change. So the long-seated and well-respected special education director was retiring, and she, as a part of that transition, the district had commissioned a third-party review of the special education services in the district. So that review became the blueprint, really, of what was, what recommendations there were, and maybe some ideas about why certain things needed to change. The review included interviews with stakeholders, obviously data analysis. They looked at where students were learning, how they were learning, what LRE looked like in Palo Alto Unified, and really what an experience for a student would look like if they happen to be receiving services through an IEP. Through that special education review, which was handed to me during my first month of transition in July by my boss, she said these are the recommendations that the plan found to be important to the school district moving forward. So I took that plan and I built an action plan with a timeline, and I created a template to start the work. And so that was really helpful. So if you have an opportunity to look at your district, and certainly with a third-party lens, that's always helpful, or maybe a critical colleague or peer, it's very, very useful to have someone help you determine what's going on in your district and where there are key changes that could be made. I think the other most important thing that first year was really bringing the human capital along. And so there's one thing to have an idea, it's one thing to have a review, but you need the buy-in from the folks that you work with. And when I say folks that you work with, I mean teachers, and I also mean instructional staff, and I certainly mean our principal leaders. So that became part of my message that was very consistent, and certainly I had a wonderful staff to work with, and we were all delivering on message, which was we are going to move towards building inclusive school communities where every student every day can access meaningful learning and be a part of a community. So
that's really important to pay attention to that. Come on.
So a couple of facts certainly that hold true today, and that is we have a early childhood center for learning, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges we had in preschool in a minute. We have 12 elementary schools, we have 3 middle schools and 2 high schools. We serve approximately 12,380 students preschool through post-secondary, and about 1,075 students currently receive services through special education with an IEP. I think some of you may remember a few years ago there was a book, All I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. What was that book called?
All I Ever Need to Know is I Learned in Kindergarten.
There you go.
Something like that.
All right. Well, so when I came to Palo Alto, I just flipped that back one grade level, and I quickly realized that our preschool program needed some attention. So a very dear colleague of mine at the time and I work together to create an inclusive preschool program. What we found when we got there was that there were multiple preschool classrooms across the district. Some of them were in elementary schools. One was at our preschool early learning center, Greendale, and one was at another elementary school. So really our services were all spread out. There wasn't a lot of coordination between the teachers. Actually, there was no coordination between the teachers, and there didn't really seem to be any rhyme or reason to determine where the students were placed based on those programs. So one preschool classroom for students with IEPs at the preschool did exist, but it wasn't a part of the Greendale school. It wasn't a part of the Greendale community or the Greendale family. So that was really an excellent place, as I wrote on the slide, an excellent place to start.
To get started.
Lots of, go ahead, we can go to the next one. A lot of really difficult conversations, I think, but very productive conversations. And ultimately what we ended up with was, I think, a very best practice state-of-the-art preschool program where we're seeing a lot of positive growth in our early childhood learners. A couple of more things about what was when I got to Palo Alto. Our elementary schools were clustered in 3 different areas, and each cluster had a special day class or 2 that were essentially categorical based on disability and supports. Students were moved at the end of their K-1 experience to another 2-3 experience, and sometimes even to a second or third 3-5 experience. So an elementary student in Palo Alto might have to move 3 times before they got to middle school, which for our students who like routine, who like structure, who are very, very, keen on positive relationships, it was very difficult for them to continue to have to start over again. It's difficult for our families and certainly difficult for the staff. So that was the second thing we decided we needed to do, was stop moving kids around and move the services to them as opposed to moving them to the services. Another key finding in the review was that many of our families and certainly our principal leaders looked to the district office for many of the decisions, and that the ownership of the student really varied from school to school, whether or not that student was a member of that campus and whether or not their family became a member of that community really depended on the principal and the teacher. So we thought that was really important to redefine what that looked like, to make site level leadership decisions, to own all of your students, and to certainly give our special education teachers, our ed specialists, and general education teachers a share in the ownership of those students, because every child, I think our premise was really that every student needed to be a member of the community where they went to school every day. So we definitely moved toward that. That was a heavy lift, and I think some principals were definitely more comfortable wearing that hat than others, but we've definitely, again, stayed on message and created a place where that site level decision making, that principal leadership, ownership of the students, and that's from the very first IEP or transition plan, like in elementary school, from preschool to kindergarten. We started a very deliberate process where the elementary principals would go to the preschool, and that really helped. That really helped build that relationship from the beginning for the student and the family, so that was helpful. We moved some language, which is also, language is very powerful, so you start building an inclusive model. Some of the places where students used to learn didn't really make as much sense. So we shifted our language from special day classes to learning centers. And while a lot of people are unsure about the differences between a special day class and a learning center, we have pretty much kept on message that a learning center, the differences between a learning center and a special day class historically are that special day classes, students typically spent the majority of their day in the class and did not come out of the classroom for learning in the general education environment. They may have participated in recess, or PE or art, but definitely not for some of the academic areas in the general education classroom. We also see that learning center model allows for the door to open both ways. So general education students come in, special education students come in and go out, just as the teacher comes in and goes out. So that teacher in the learning center might go and spend time in the general education classroom in order to deliver instruction in the least restrictive environment. So those are a couple of important name changes or shifts we made that I think were very powerful. Another lesson learned, or certainly a lesson learned along the way, is that we started using the word full inclusion. And full inclusion, I think, has a lot of connotations, both very positive as well as some negative connotations. And it doesn't account for the variability in all learners. So full inclusion means something entirely different to every student that you serve. So while LRE is our target and allowing the student, certainly giving the student the opportunity to participate in that least restrictive environment first, before they go into the learning center environment, started to be the focus of where we shifted our thinking. So rather than placing students in learning center for their primary placement, we placed all students over a few years, it took us a few years to do this, in the general education classroom as their primary placement. And then they would receive services throughout the day, either in that general ed setting, on the playground, in itinerant offices or classrooms, or in the learning center. So that was an important decision and to make in terms of distinguishing between full inclusion and building inclusive schools. Mm-hmm. And I would caution against using the word full inclusion. Although I believe in it, I don't necessarily think that using full inclusion as your word or your messaging does allow for the variability of all learners. So I think I would caution against using full. Meaningful inclusion, yes. Full inclusion, no.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Redefined programs, I think is what it says. Redefined school programs. So again, reflecting back on what I said a little bit earlier, as we did an analysis of the current state of our elementary school programs, we did realize that students were essentially given their preschool experience, which didn't necessarily seem to be closely tied to what was happening in kindergarten. So we fixed that up a little bit. And then their kindergarten and first grade experience across the district seemed to be diagnostic in nature. And most of those K-1 experiences were not on campuses that continued through the 5th grade school year. So all of the K-1 experiences then were 2 years only, and then they had to move to another campus. So we did some very quick analysis of how we might build out our inclusive model across the district, and quickly decided that having that K-1 diagnostic year was probably not the best use of the students' time, that we would use that preschool time, those 3 years in preschool, if we had them, to absolutely get to know the student, their needs, and figure out how best to support them. And our first and primary consideration would have been their neighborhood school. So building out neighborhood school model across the district was very important for us. And we almost did it as far as building out the neighborhood school. We have, most schools are able to serve all students with the exception of 3 at this point. Did any parents not agree to inclusion? Is that what
this was a question that just came up from one of our listeners. Did any parents not agree to inclusion?
Yes. So actually that's a great question, and it came up a lot when we first started this work. And I would say that parents of students without IEPs and parents of students with IEPs both had some questions and some concerns about building inclusive practices. I was heartened the other day to go to a parent coffee at one of our first schools where we piloted the idea of inclusion, and it was a 100% turnaround in terms of the concerns that I heard from the parents of students in general education 5 years ago were the typical ones that you hear, that students with IEPs will take away time from the teacher, they'll distract the learning from my student who doesn't have an IEP, and those kinds of, stereotypical or typical things that we hear around inclusion. And that has changed. I think everyone at that school now, I would say, in general, sees the opportunity to build an inclusive school community as good for all students, and certainly builds empathy and builds a different generation of learners who will be much more accepting and kind moving forward. So as far as students with IEPs and their parents, there were some concerns about building inclusive practices. There were concerns about what their student would be doing in the general ed and if they would be welcomed. And I think that those are all real concerns, and I think individually you have to take those on one by one. And obviously spending as much time with families to help them understand that. And I always think welcoming families into the classroom is a good way to navigate those questions. So Thank you for the question. That was great. So we did freeze the students in the elementary schools where they were, and we started building out a K-5 model at all of our elementary schools, again, with the exception of a few of them. At those schools where we have a K-5 model, we have staffed the school with 2 education specialists, typically 1 education specialist with a moderate to severe credential and 1 with a mild moderate credential, so that we could serve the full continuum of students that might happen to be at that school. We also have itinerant staff that travel, obviously, to all of our schools to support the students. So rather than being site-specific, the services became portable, and we were able to at least consider, for the most part, neighborhood school placement for students coming out of our preschool. So that really was a shift. So the initial resources needed to support students in new environments were absolutely mindset driven. So one of the key folks that I found in working through these few years where we were moving the model was the school secretary. Why do you ask? The school secretary does classroom placements. So having the school secretary understand what the model was and shifting the practice of not placing students with IEPs in the general education setting to placing them in the general education setting was very important. And that's important because we don't want students who have IEPs to be additional students in the classroom. We want them to be members of the classroom and certainly thought of as full members of the classroom, which means they have a desk that looks like everybody else's, they have a name tag that looks like everybody else's, and they are considered as a part of that classroom, maybe even from the front end as opposed to the back end. So that was one thing that we did in identifying those important people. It was also the principal and our ed specialists. So ed specialists carrying that message and delivering the instruction in different environments. For some of our teachers who were delivering instruction K1, and then we asked them to do K5. That's a learning curve involved there. So those teachers were critical to our resource development at the individual school sites. Do you still have specialized separate SDC programs for moderate severe population, or do you do learning centers? Good question. We have typically moved that SDC model into that learning center approach, so that yes, we can serve students who have more significant disabilities, and we do have a couple who serve who are, let's say, more specialized in their supports for students who have more significant needs. That wasn't our initial thinking, but it has turned out to be something that we needed to keep in place over time. So serving students at the elementary level, one of our schools serves students who have, are impacted by multiple disabilities, who maybe have healthcare needs and things like that. So we do have one learning center that provides that intensive support. Those students still are included at their general education campus. They are a part of the community. And for the most part, when we do have students who have significant needs and they do want to attend their neighborhood school, we do everything we can to attempt to be able to serve them in those schools. The idea of building community is that you go to the school that's close to your home, and that you obviously have the opportunity to go to school with your brothers and sisters and be a part of that community. So when we can address those needs, we try to do that. So let's do the next slide.
Okay.
So we tried several different models of support for teachers. That's both in the classroom, in the learning center, general education, across the board. And our first attempt was to establish Teachers on Special Assignment, or TOSAs. So several years ago, we established the Inclusion TOSA, which the Teacher on Special Assignment was given for elementary schools and supported the work of inclusion at those 4 elementary schools. So we had 3 TOSAs, and they did, essentially work as a team. They worked with the individual school sites. They became a part of that individual school site team and really worked on individual supports, ideas, building curriculum supports, and accommodations and modifications for students who were part of an inclusive classroom. They coached the general education teacher as well as the ed specialist, and did parent education, some of, attend IEP meetings. They became a part of the IEP process. We used a lot of the TOSA support for transition between preschool and kindergarten, just to make sure that the students had the first entry into kindergarten was positive. And we used that on the job training model, embedded support as something that we felt would be really important for our teachers as they embarked on building inclusive practices. So the teachers on special assignment were also critical in professional learning opportunities for our instructional aides. They did some instructional aid training and coaching, and they were essential in planning the professional learning for our teachers in the years that they were on board.
Next.
Mm-hmm.
Come on.
So one of the things that our TOSAs did, and I think it's important to have this extra set of eyes and hands when you're building inclusive classrooms, because many of the general education teachers had a lot of questions about how to make sure that they could deliver instruction and the student could be successful in their classes. Lots of questions with great intent. So our TOSAs worked very closely with the teachers on building positive learning environments. And these are some of the things that they met with teachers about and helped to develop in the classrooms that they worked in. So building the relationship and the respect with the teacher was a key consideration for our TOSAs. And so they became, a part of that school community so that they could support the students. That was very key. And most teachers, do like coaching, but for the most part, teachers are in their classrooms on their own. So you have to build that rapport and that respect from the front end. Reviewing expectations for roles and responsibilities. That became very, very important, because we did not want the student with an IEP or the student with a disability to be seen as someone else's responsibility. We absolutely wanted the general education teacher to see that student as a member of their classroom. And we wanted to make sure that, when we were thinking about placing students in classrooms, placing them within the classroom among peers, that we were using lots of different strategies to support them, whether they were tangible materials, visuals, or different cues to support the student to be successful. And obviously, just like all of the literature says, we relied significantly on the students' peers, because many of the peers had excellent ideas for helping to include the student far beyond the capacity of the adults to come up with creative, innovative ways to support students. So we definitely, the more clear and the more concrete the support is that you can give that general ed teacher, the more successful I believe the student and the teacher experience will be. Okay, so one of the, again, going back to shifting a unified school district that operated in a certain way to a model that looks and feels and sounds quite different was really about shifting that very old adage about special education being a service and not a place. And I think that certainly in 2010 in our school district, special education was viewed as a place, and it was viewed as potentially the responsibility of the district office, with very, very highly qualified teachers and principals out there in the field, but with any problems or challenges moving automatically to the district level. So shifting that map of services, creating the itinerant staff that had the skills and the capacity to serve all the students in the multiple environments they were in was a big part of that focus. Creating visuals for principals, creating, when I say map of services, essentially the kinds of services that we can deliver and the school sites where we can deliver them. So really creating a visual around, here are the schools that we used to be able to serve students in, here are the schools we can serve students in now, and here is the host of services and supports that we can provide at that school. So I think it was important to have a visual, and it was important, again, to stay on that message that's, inclusive practices are about building community, about helping students belong, and that, it wasn't very difficult. Again, my colleagues are highly professional, wonderful people, and it wasn't that difficult to engage their hearts and their minds in thinking about that every student had a place at their schools. So I use that strategy, and I would say that that philosophical shift between special day class model and place model versus service model was engaging our principals and our teachers' hearts and minds, and that really became part of the message that people would expect from me. And so I'll go back to, I think it is important to be on your message and stay on your message, and certainly in my case, engaging the heart and the soul and the mind in that process. So ownership. More on ownership. Again, I think having conversations with parents over the years where essentially maybe instead of going directly to the school site, a parent might call the district office, and whether or not that's their typical practice or that's what they were used to, the conversation typically needs to be about the person who knows your school, your student, or the people who know your student the best are the people who see your student every day, and that's their teachers and their principal. And that's where we started to shift the community into realizing that that first point of contact is the site level leadership, the site level team, and that's hard work, and that's ongoing, because I think, sometimes process takes time, and people get, what is the word when you say impatient with process. So, and we have to stay on that message. And even though at some points as directors of special education or folks working at the district office level, you can essentially maybe sometimes see a problem and certainly have an idea and maybe a solution that you can think of that would be quite rapid. I caution you to always redirect those decisions to that IEP team and to that site level team, because that will begin to shift the ownership and the knowledge of that student to the people who see that student every day.
Thank you. Very well said.
So I always talk a little bit about the Valentine list, because I certainly learned a lot about how students come to be known as members of a school community. And one of those things that happens at the beginning of the year when you are placed on a classroom roster is that your name becomes a part of that classroom roster. Your information, if you will be shared as a part of that February Valentine's list that gets distributed to the rest of the classroom. The field trip list is also generated by that same roster. And those are important considerations when you talk about being members and having belonging at a school or in a classroom community. The idea that if you're not there, that someone notices that you're not there is important as well. So being a part of that classroom, being on that roster, beginning the very first day, and some of the practices that we have adopted are that student begins that first morning activity in that general education classroom, that is lining up with their peers and waiting for that bell to ring, and whatever supports they need to be able to be successful in that class, we have been able to provide that. So those are some of the things that when we talked about learning centers and school placement and those portable itinerant services, that we really talk and thought a lot about that placement in that general education classroom. Using the TOSA support was obviously critical as well, and doing district-wide efforts to increase understanding of inclusion. We worked with the Inclusion Collaborative. We had Rich Villa come several times to talk about inclusive practices, and Rich is excellent in talking about inclusion, the benefits to all students. Certainly he's very well versed in co-teaching and the benefits of co-teaching. He also is very good at delivering that connection between heart and mind, and so I feel like he was a real essential and critical part to our journey in helping our leadership get on board with knowing that this was the right direction. We also worked with West Ed. We attended conferences. We took key leaders to conferences, and we built much of our professional learning days around the ideas of inclusion collaborative. As we move forward with some of the efforts in creating our next steps, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end, looking at the Special Education Task Force in terms of their recommendations through the state. We are looking at universal design, an MTSS approach, and certainly we've worked with CAST, and we're just starting our relationship with CAST at this point. But this is definitely the next frontier, kind of looking at inclusion from the general education perspective as opposed to the special education perspective, and I think that's an important shift for us.
Holly, we had a question from one of our listeners. Where, who, what was some of your favorite models, resources for what drives your program? For example, how are you inspired to create the map of service? Where did that come from? Amazing.
Let's see. So our models really were, again, sort of tapping into that philosophical and sort of heart and mind thinking around this is the best thing for kids. How do we teach kids to be kind if we don't have kids learning together? And I think that that's where we kept delivering on that message. We had a showing of including Samuel, for instance, where we had parent education, we had principal leadership, we had district-wide efforts to create that buy-in, if you will. And as far as the map of services, really, it's probably twofold. One is that I'm a visual learner, and secondly, that I think a lot of people are visual learners. So it's very difficult to explain something without giving them that visual. So I think for the most part, this idea of neighborhood school was the driver of certainly our elementary programs as well as our secondary programs, and we sort of had to do backwards planning. If neighborhood school was going to be our goal, how are we going to be able to support all students? So we do continue to have specialized programs to support students with unique needs around emotional behavioral well-being, or as I said earlier, medical needs, but for the most part we are able to serve most students at all of our schools, which was the goal from the first of our journey. Yeah, I don't know. I think probably
visual.
I think the inspiration is really a visual, right? And then creating those openings for folks to understand that compassion that comes with supporting all kids, and the learning that comes for all everyone involved when you are supporting students who learn differently, and certainly the contention is that all students learn differently, so that it wasn't that big of a leap, although we definitely needed to get some supports in place. One challenge I think we continue to have is that the students continue to need behavioral supports, and one of the things that gets students noticed, whether they have IEPs or not, is whether or not they're behaving in such a way that helps them be successful in the classroom. So I would say that, as we move forward, behavioral supports or behavior support team needs to be a bit more comprehensive in supporting the positive behavior approach before we get to an IEP, and to help students be successful in the classroom without needing an IEP. So those are some of the challenges we have. Like many districts, we also over-identify students who are historically underrepresented, and that's also something that we're looking at RTI and MTSS to help us identify ways to screen and support early intervention, as opposed to having special education be sort of a fast track to the only way you can get services. So this is an area of concern for us. As far as our secondary model, we were sort of working on both ends simultaneously. So one of the things, while we were working on our preschool elementary model, we were also working on our secondary model and building that co-teaching and co-planning. There were several different paths that we could have taken on the high school, but again, I think looking at the model that we had in 2010, which was primarily a separate special day class model with almost all core curriculum delivered in that separate model for students who had more severe learning disabilities. One immediate way, without having to look at staffing to address that, was really to look at the co-teaching model. So that was the path we chose. Co-teaching is a wonderful opportunity for two teachers to work together. It's also very time consuming and can be challenging. So we've definitely had some bumps. But in the co-teaching, again, our pioneers, our advocates, our champions were those education specialist leaders at the high schools and at the middle schools who had the relationships with their other teachers and were able to build those relationships out into co-teaching. So it was definitely a relationship model as opposed to a systems model, which I think also you have to make decisions based on your particular district and the particular needs of your students. But in our district, in terms of a systems change, the relational aspect of some of the things that we did, I think helped get us to the place where we are now, and made some good decisions and had some great outcomes for kids. Working with general education staff, becoming a part of professional learning, planning for general education staff, working with the counterparts in secondary education and elementary education has been critical to the role as well, making sure that you're not necessarily thinking outside of what that general education professional learning platform is, but you're a part of that thinking and that learning. So strategic learning, I wrote on here, and then the learning center model. So really looking at several years into the co-teaching model, we decided to shift, not necessarily from co-teaching, but using an instructional coach. So much like the TOSAs, we put in an instructional coach at all of our secondary schools, and that coach was specifically put in place, had been trained pretty significantly in co-teaching to be a mentor, an embedded coach in those co-teaching classrooms. So that really served us well, and I think has provided some good support to our co-teaching partners. So one of the things we really talked about was when we looked at the classrooms where students were learning, and this continues to be our work as we go forward. What does staffing look like? What are the adults doing in the room? What are the students doing in the room? And where was the learning happening? And I think those were all critical questions at each one of our schools, because each one of our schools continues to operate a little bit differently in terms of how they serve kids. Our model is built on a high level of adult to student support, and that may or may not be the best way to promote independence, to promote ownership, but it certainly is a way that we have been able to build out the model currently. But it is critical to see and to consider and always monitor what adults are doing and what students are doing and how students play that important role in their education. So I think we continue to look at our specialized classrooms, our learning centers, what the adults are doing, where they're delivering instruction. And one other key consideration that's come up recently is how are we delivering the targeted instruction, the evidence-based instruction that students need and require to meet their goals and objectives on their IEPs. This is something that we are going to look kind of recalibrate on as we move forward, because I think that sometimes you see a trade-off in terms of building inclusive practices and then really having to struggle with where does that evidence-based instruction occur, and where is it best for the student for that instruction to occur, and at what time of the day. So these are all challenges both at the elementary and the secondary level when you talk about pulling kids out or pushing in and trying to tie that intensive instruction to the same learning that the other peers in their classrooms are doing, and if that environment is quiet enough or there's free of distraction. I don't know very many elementary school classrooms that are free of distraction. So you really have to think about where that student needs to be to access their learning, and that's where that continuum of inclusion, I think, comes into play. Really important to consider.
We had a question from one of our listeners. How many students with special ed services on average are at each site?
Great question. So at the high school, we have a little bit of a disparity right now. We have a little over 110 students at one of our high schools and a little over 220 at another one of our high schools. So that's something we'd like to see balance out, since both of our high schools are approximately the same size. And both of those high schools serve approximately the same the same students, and we have a variety of different learning center intensive programs at both high schools. At our middle schools, depending on the size, I would say anywhere from a 1,200 student school might have 100 students with IEPs, and our smaller middle school has about 60 students with IEPs, and they serve about 750 kids total. At the elementary schools, anywhere from, and that would be inclusive of students with just maybe speech services as well as more intensive services, I would say anywhere from, let's say, 30 to 40, and a couple of our schools, 2 of our schools actually have 3 learning centers, so they serve a few more students. And some of that's driven by the neighborhood, and some of that's driven by growing out of the old model of having those classrooms that broke up into grade level. Nonetheless, the students do stay at the same elementary school, but we do have some students who have needs to shift from classroom to classroom. So I would say anywhere at the elementary school from probably, as low as 10 and as many as about 45 total. Do you have time to give?
I think what we're going to do is we're getting a lot of questions, and we're close to being at the end, so we're going to answer all the questions at the end, if that's okay with you.
Great.
All right.
I think we're close to the end of the slides as well. So part of the messaging that was important, and this kind of goes without saying, is that no one was doing anything wrong. They were just doing what they had always done. And I think it's important to stay positive in terms of where you want to go. And it's not an error analysis. It's really just, a continuous improvement cycle. Next one. Couple of important distinctions to make and to help build a common language, and obviously you'll have access to these slides, so I won't go through them, but there's a bunch of words here that we've used over time to mean a bunch of different things, whether it's how you define inclusion or how you define mainstreaming. I think it's important to help your teachers and your principals have that common language, so that if we're messaging to parents, teachers, everybody's talking about the services in the same way. Okay, we'll move on from this one so we can get to your questions. So we can move on from that one too. Okay, so my third one was really about recommendations and just some key learnings. And I think everyone always does this, but it's always good to remind each other to always put the students first. Be patient and include all of your stakeholders in your communication, and that definitely carries on to to your community, to your parent communities, parent coffees, listening campaigns, whatever you can do. It's definitely something that is ongoing, and I would recommend doing continuously. Every student has the capacity to be successful, and this idea of presumed competence, which we all learned about many, many years ago, knowing your students, creating those safe learning environments, and designing your environments around that variation in every learner while presuming competence in every learner, I think is key. And this happens to be just a part of our district mission. So if you can tie the work to your current district mission, it's important to show that this is a part of that school district in their broad mission of how to serve students.
Great idea. All right, we are finally at questions, and people are just asking questions left and right. Our last question, actually the one in the queue for the next to be answered, is, do you have time to give some specifics of what scheduling the TOSA looks like? Or can you share some materials from a different format other than this meeting?
Sure. We can share some materials for sure, and I'll send them through Kathy. As far as the TOSA's schedules were concerned, let's say, for instance, one of the gals had 4 schools. She would work with the principals at those 4 schools, and she would schedule her time. Let's say, for instance, they wanted her to be a part of the weekly SST or something like that. She would schedule her time around those meetings, around critical IEPs, and around the the students and their needs for supports in the general education setting. We had a fair amount of questions around who does that inclusion TOSA support? Do they support the ed specialist, or do they support the general education teacher? And I think, like many of our attorneys will say, I'll say it depends. But I think that those are critical relationships, and that they really did drive their own schedules with those schools that they supported. They also worked together really well, so building that team and getting that team in front of folks as often as possible. They might do a staff meeting in terms of building universal supports or things like that. But really they built their own schedule with their 4 individual schools, and that was so that they could accommodate the needs of the students and the teachers in the general education classrooms.
Thank you. Great question. Another one we have for you is, are your assigned coaches part of the special education division, or were you able to get educational services to own the coaches and thus provide supports to staff and programs, regardless of whether they're SPED or general ed?
That's a great question. And I think that's where I would love to see the district go in their next frontier. And that is when you look at MTSS, how are you providing that coaching across the district? To answer your question, yes, all of the coaches were paid for out of special education. I had one pioneering principal who paid for his prior to moving toward that model, which I think is, in his case, he had the FTE and he allocated that position, and I think that was a wonderful approach. But for the most part, those services were coming through special education.
Okay. What other duties were they assigned, these coaches?
The elementary TOSAs were district-based employees, and they were assigned to be a part of that district team, professional learning. They were assigned training the instructional aides, providing direct support to the sites, and as far as the instructional coaches at the secondary level, they were site-based. They didn't report to the district level, and they really became a part of that Department of Special Education at the secondary site.
That was the last part of our question. Were they site or district-based? So elementary was district-based, and high school, post-secondary, or secondary were site-based.
Yes.
Great. Let's see, is there one more question? Do you present at AXA? And if so, how well is your message being received?
I haven't presented at AXA. I'm going to AXA, see you tomorrow.
Okay.
And but I have presented at several different conferences with a team, and I think a team is a better approach. I mean, Kathy's my team today, but presenting with a team I think has been very well received. And in general, I think when you break it down and you create strategic pathways, I think people appreciate that, and it makes it a little bit more doable. Taking a unified school district with more traditional practices towards inclusion is hard work, and it's not something that you finish or complete or get done. You just continue to have those conversations, and each day parents and adults present challenges around including students, but I think we're reminded how important it is when you see those communities shift to include all students, that it's really critical.
We had another question. How much time do special ed and general ed teachers collaborate each week, and did they build in extra time?
So that's a great question, and we currently are in conversations with our teachers union about working conditions. I would like to see a little bit more concrete language about how much time teachers are working together. At the secondary level, it is a little bit easier to, let's say for instance, schedule teachers to have the same common prep as their ed specialist, maybe co-teaching partner. But time is not in our favor during the school day to help our colleagues collaborate with each other and to plan. One of the challenges I think moving forward with universal design is that it is very time consuming, and that we do need to look at some language around building time for teachers to work together and to collaborate. Was there one more question?
We just got another question. You're just very popular. Have you seen positive impacts yet, as in increase in student outcomes and a decrease in due process? That is a Very good question.
Alejandro, that's a great question.
Thank you, Ella.
So, as far as student outcomes, I would say that our preschool program has very much improved the transition from preschool to kindergarten. For our elementary students, I think that the positive outcomes that I see are really about relationships, and as they transition to middle school, they're very well, they have lots of relationships with kids, and those transitions become a little bit easier. As far as overall student outcomes, there's a couple of things that we've done recently. We had a systems review done this year, which is available on our website if you'd like to look at it. And it had a couple of very interesting findings. One was that general education teachers believe in the district, of those that took the survey, that students with IEPs are better served in the general education environment. I think that's a fantastic measure of how our teachers are owning the students. The other measure that we typically use is really around how students are performing on the statewide achievement tests. As far as our students with IEPs, they are meeting and exceeding standards at the same level as the typical population across the state. One of the challenges with using the CAS metric is that our students with disabilities don't perform well on statewide assessments. So it may or may not be the right measure, but it is a measure that allows us to know that they are accessing the curriculum. Other measures, I guess, as far as due process, I don't know that we can truly, if there's a nexus between lower due process and inclusion. I would say anecdotally that we certainly hear from families that they're moving to Palo Alto because there is some feeling that we are doing some things around inclusion that are positive and productive for students and successful. So I think developing some of those metrics in terms of how students are doing would be critical at this point.
All right. Do we have any more questions? It looks like we have stopped answering or asking.
Okay.
And it is almost 12 noon. And I would really like to thank Holly. Yay! For being here today.
Thank you.
We will send out today's PowerPoint and a survey link. And it sounds like you might have some other visuals in a different format that you'll share with us. I just had a question if we could get the link that your district has an assessment, you said?
Oh, so if you go to our website, pausd.org, we currently did a special education systems review, and that was completed at the end of last fall. And that, again, looked at our practices, our services, our supports. We were really thinking critically about our co-teaching and our inclusive practices. So that report is available on our website. If you'd like to read it, it's available in 3 different languages, and I'm happy to, if anyone has any questions, you can email me directly, hwade@pausd.org.
And I just want to say our last question is fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank
Yay.
you. Thank you.
It is really inspiring to hear a district that's doing this, and it's not an easy journey, we know.
Well, it takes a lot of people.
Congratulations.
Take care of your people. That's what I say.
Take care of your people.
Because it takes a village. So
it does take a village. Anyways, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. This will be recorded, and our next Supporting Inclusive Practices webinar will be on February 28th. 2017 on implementation, evaluation, phase 4. So you will get an email reminder about that also. So take care. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.